Hi, I'm Zac Masiba, and today I'll be presenting the practices of Montana violin makers. How does somebody take a chunk of wood and make it into a beautiful instrument? Well, in this presentation, we'll be discussing the violin making processes of 3 Montana luthiers from start to finish. Stephen Boone has been residing in Bozeman since 2004 and has been an active luthier for over a decade. During his time here, Mr. Boone has created over 60 violins, violas, and guitars. Mr. Boone is a self-taught luthier, meaning, in his own words, that he has to pay for all the mistakes that he makes along the way. He says that after 10 years of self-training, he's likely at the same place as somebody who went to a luthiering school for 4 years. Mr. Boone stressed that the most important aspect of a pleasant violin sound was ensuring that the top plate of the violin vibrates relative to how the back plate of the violin vibrates. The sound post, pictured on the right, is also important for a good sound. He said if it's wedged in too tight, then the instrument can't vibrate as well. Mr. Boone buys his wood from a supplier in Virginia, who in turn gets his wood from Romania. He also buys more intricate pieces, pegs, tailpieces, and such, from an outfit in Maryland. The 4 main parts Mr. Boone focused on are the rib structure, the back plate, the top plate, and the neck, all of which are made by hand. When gluing everything together, he ensures that the top, back, and rib structure are all parallel and were all similarly and recently made. The neck and the scroll, the swirly bit at the top of the violin, is hand-carved and difficult to make, sometimes taking as long to make as the entire body of the instrument, which is about 10 days. The shape of the arches took especially long to get right for Mr. Boone. The only way to feel good about it is to repeat the process many times. The climate in Bozeman is perfect for violin making. Mr. Boone says that his shop is usually around 50% humidity and that it's easy to maintain, only needing to bring in a humidifier during the winter times. Mr. Boone stated that the cost of a violin is heavily determined by name brand and the recognition of the maker. For him, however, Mr. Boone prefers to price his instruments based on how much labor went into creating it. As he makes more instruments, he generally raises the price, knowing that each one was better than the last. Mr. Boone regularly repairs instruments for Bozeman public schools, mostly for the middle schools. He's happy to be a resource for the Bozeman music community, especially for young, developing players that need help. Over in Missoula, we have Mark Hollinger. Mr. Hollinger began making violins in Montana in 1974 at the age of 16. He's worked and studied across Europe and the US, winning several awards for violins that he made. Mark Hollinger attended the Violin Making School of America in Salt Lake City, completing his studies in 1983. In our interview, Mr. Hollinger emphasized that good-sounding instruments must have every variable put together in a detailed fashion. Everything in the violin is made to work together, and there's no one secret to a good sound. Mark has bought his wood from Europe since the 80s, building up an impressive collection of wood ever since. Mr. Hollinger starts by creating a template from one of his several violin models. He works on the fine details of the scroll and the outline, then makes a mold that the template can be put around. He roughs out the wood to meet the parameters of his mold, then finishes by adjusting the woodwork and varnishing the product. Mark stated that the Missoula climate is similar to Cremona, Italy, where some of the finest violins ever made were built by Antonio Stradivari. The humidity and altitude allows the wood to season and dry out in a favorable way. Although he produces quality instruments, Mr. Hollinger said that being in Montana leads him to price his instruments lower. In his own words, you just can't charge in Montana what some of his colleagues would charge in New York. Mr. Hollinger has trained some people that help the local schools with repairs, but he doesn't have the time to do any himself. With his focus mainly on making violins, Mr. Hollinger tends to patrons on a national level, having instruments made by him scattered across the country. Our final stop is in Billings, where I interviewed John Kirk. Mr. Kirk is a cellist who has studied and played across the US and Europe. He began making violins in Billings in 1983 and has since made hundreds of violins, cellos, and violas. Mr. Kirk honed his craft through several apprenticeships across the country. He would observe his teachers making violins and would mimic them as much as possible, refining his work until it resembled what his teachers made. He states that after 4 years, it's possible to produce a decent instrument. Similar to what Stephen Boone stressed as important, John Kirk described the relation between the top plate of the violin and the bottom plate of the violin as a crucial relationship within the instrument. He also states that the resonance of the bass bar, pictured above, can give the violin a dark or light sound. In the beginning, Mr. Kirk acquired his wood from domestic suppliers in the western US, but eventually switched to buying German wood, stating that it provided more sound and a higher pitch than American wood. For violin bows, he prefers to buy fresh horsehair from his suppliers because old hair dries out and becomes brittle. Mr. Kirk specializes in machine making for his violins. After choosing a preset model to shape the violin after, various machines and computer programs carve the wood to a point where he can hand finish the minor details and make slight adjustments. Similarly to Mark Hollinger, John Kirk describes the varnishing process as a difficult learning curve. Varnish inhibits tone, so it's crucial to use the least amount possible. Billings's climate provides a stable amount of humidity, which is good for the violins, as sudden changes in heat or humidity can warp and damage the wood. Mr. Kirk said that in general, people judge an instrument by the quality of the wood. How the instrument sounds has some effect on its cost, but the main driver of the selling price is whether or not the violin has visual beauty. Besides repairing instruments for School District 2 in Billings, Mr. Kirk does repairs for several other Montana towns. Although he takes pride in making instruments, he admits that repairs usually take priority, as it pays the bills and keeps him occupied. These interviews display the important roles that each of these luthiers play in their respective musical communities, and how being in Montana affects their craft. For future research that will help advance the instrument-making field, it could be worthwhile to study the violin-making processes of luthiers in other states or regions, how the processes for making other instruments are affected by Montana's climate, and the community impact that luthiers have in a more urban or more rural environment. Finally, I'd like to say thank you to the 3 luthiers I interviewed for this project. Thank you to Stephen Boone of Bozeman, Mark Hollinger in Missoula, and John Kirk in Billings. I'd also like to give a big thank you to Dr. Greg Young, who helped guide me every step of the way during this project. Thank you.